The ground trembled, not from an earthquake, but from something far more terrifying. On the endless plains near Kursk, the silence of dawn was shattered by the thunder of engines. Thousands of them. From horizon to horizon, the earth groaned, under the weight of steel monsters preparing for the greatest armored clash the world had ever seen. This wasn't just a battle. It was a war within a war, a collision of ideologies, machines, and men, all converging in a storm of fire and iron. The year was 1943. Germany, desperate to turn the tide after the devastating loss at Stalingrad, had launched Operation Citadel. Hitler was banking everything on a massive assault, believing one decisive blow could crush Soviet morale. But what awaited the Wehrmacht was not weakness. It was a fortress, Kursk, fortified with mines, bunkers, artillery, and, above all, unshakable Soviet resolve. And then it began. The roar of engines, the grinding of tracks, the sky lit with tracer fire. The largest tank battle in human history had erupted. This is the story of Kursk, where metal clashed with metal, and the fate of the Eastern Front was sealed in smoke and steel. Before we dive into this epic battle, smash that like button if you're ready to witness history's greatest tank clash. Subscribe now to Fragments of History and never miss the untold stories that shaped our world. And tell us in the comments, do you think Kursk was the true turning point of World War II? Because what you're about to see is not just history, it's war, it's Kursk. The winter of 1942-1943 marked a devastating turning point for Nazi Germany. The Battle of Stalingrad and a brutal, months-long siege had ended in catastrophe. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht was shattered, its Sixth Army encircled and defeated, marking the first major defeat of Hitler's forces on the Eastern Front. This defeat was not just a military loss, it was a blow to Nazi morale, a shattering crack in the myth of invincibility. The German war machine, battered and bloodied, faced a resurgent Soviet Union, which had gained momentum and confidence from their hard-fought victory. But Hitler was not a man to accept defeat lightly. Determined to regain the initiative, he conceived a bold, ambitious plan. Operation Citadel. His goal, to strike at the massive Soviet salient near the city of Kursk, a bulge in the front lines that offered the chance for a decisive victory. Hitler believed that a crushing blow here could encircle and destroy large Soviet forces, reversing the tide of war. The German High Command poured men, tanks, and aircraft into preparations for what would become the largest armored offensive in history. Yet the Soviets were no strangers to the threat. Intelligence reports warned of the impending attack, allowing the Red Army to fortify Kursk's defenses to an unprecedented degree, laying millions of mines, building thousands of bunkers, and positioning artillery in deadly depth. The stage was set, two mighty armies poised for an epic showdown. As July 1943 approached, the world held its breath, waiting for the roar of engines and the thunder of steel to once again shatter the fragile silence of war. After receiving intelligence about the impending German assault, the Soviet command knew that Kursk would be the focal point of the coming battle. Unlike any other point on the Eastern Front, this bulge in the front lines represented a critical target, and the Soviets were determined to turn it into an impenetrable fortress. The Red Army undertook a massive and meticulous defensive effort. Over 500,000 Soviet soldiers were deployed in a vast network of trenches, bunkers, and fortified positions that stretched for dozens of miles. Engineers worked tirelessly to lay millions of anti-tank mines, booby traps, and obstacles, designed to slow and break the advance of the German armored spearhead. Behind the front lines, the Soviets built multiple layers of defenses, artillery positions carefully camouflaged, in the dense forests, hidden machine gun nests, and anti-aircraft batteries. Every inch of the battlefield was prepared to withstand the onslaught of Germany's latest tanks, including the feared Tiger and Panther models. The terrain itself was shaped to favor the defenders. The Soviets flooded fields, created artificial, swampy areas, and exploited natural ridges to force the attacking tanks into narrow, deadly kill zones. Camouflage and deception became weapons in their arsenal, misleading the Germans about the strength and exact positions of Soviet forces. Soviet commanders, including Marshal Georgy Zhukov and General Nikolai Vatutin, coordinated this immense effort with precision and patience. They were ready not only to absorb the German attack, but to launch powerful counter-offensives once the enemy's momentum was broken. Fortress Kursk was more than a defensive position. It was a symbol of Soviet resilience and strategic ingenuity, a prepared battlefield designed to turn the tide of the war in the east. As July 1943 dawned, the stage was set for one of the most brutal and decisive battles of World War II. The roar of steel was about to shake the earth, and Fortress Kursk was ready. By mid-1943, Hitler was desperate to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. After the humiliating defeat at Stalingrad and the relentless Soviet advances, the Führer believed that a decisive victory was still possible, if only the Wehrmacht could deliver a crushing blow at the Kursk salient. Thus was born Operation Citadel, a massive offensive plan aiming to pinch off the Soviet bulge near Kursk and encircle their forces. The operation called for a double pincer movement. The German Army Group South would attack from the south, while Army Group Center would strike from the north, trapping the Red Army in a deadly vice. Hitler invested enormous resources into this final gamble. Over 900,000 men, 2,700 tanks, and nearly 2,000 aircraft were assembled for the assault. Among the armored forces were the newest and most formidable German tanks, the Panther and the fearsome Tiger, designed to overpower Soviet defenses and dominate the battlefield. However, Operation Citadel was fraught with challenges from the start. The Soviets had meticulously prepared for the attack, with dense minefields, fortified defenses, and artillery positions that threatened to stall any advance. Moreover, the Germans faced fierce resistance and shortages in manpower and fuel, as their war machine was already stretched thin by multiple fronts. Despite these obstacles, the operation began in early July 1943 as the German forces launched a ferocious assault. The clash that followed would become the largest tank battle in history, a brutal test of technology, strategy, and sheer willpower. Operation Citadel was more than just an offensive. It was Hitler's last major bid to turn the tide of the war in the east. But as the battle raged on, it would become clear that Kursk would not be another victory. It would be a turning point that marked the beginning of the German retreat. July 1943 marked the beginning of an epic confrontation that would shake the very foundations of World War II. At dawn, under heavy skies, the German offensive, known as Operation Citadel, roared to life. The ground trembled as thousands of tanks and armored vehicles surged forward, their engines echoing across the vast plains near Kursk. The Wehrmacht struck with precision and force, aiming to break through the Soviet defenses swiftly before their formidable fortifications could fully engage. From the north and south, massive tank formations, packed with the latest German Panthers and Tigers, pressed relentlessly against the Soviet lines. But the Red Army was prepared. Soviet soldiers, entrenched deep within a labyrinth of mines and bunkers, met the German onslaught with fierce resistance. Artillery fire rained down, and the air was thick with smoke, dust, and the roar of engines. Tank battles erupted in shattered fields where steel giants clashed in brutal close-quarters combat. The battle was not just about numbers, but tactics and terrain. Soviet commanders carefully used the landscape to their advantage, forcing German tanks into kill zones layered with anti-tank weapons. Mines and hidden artillery positions halted many German advances, turning Kursk into a deadly maze. For days, the fighting intensified. Prolonged skirmishes tested the endurance and resolve of both sides. The world watched as the largest tank battle in history unfolded, a clash of technology, courage, and sheer willpower. Though the Germans pushed hard, the Soviet defenses held firm. Each advance was met with crushing counterattacks, and the cost in men and machines grew unbearable. As July progressed, it became clear this battle would not be a quick victory for either side. The roar of steel had only just begun, and Kursk was about to write its name into the annals of history forever. On July 12, 1943, near the small village of Prokhorovka, one of the most intense and iconic tank battles in history exploded into existence. This fierce encounter would come to symbolize the brutal, unforgiving nature of the Battle of Kursk, a true storm of steel and fire. Thousands of tanks, both German and Soviet, clashed in a thunderous melee across the rolling fields. The German Tseku SS Panzer Corps, armed with Panther and Tiger tanks, surged forward, determined to break the Soviet defenses and encircle their forces. Opposing them, the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army stood ready, prepared to meet the challenge head-on. The battlefield was chaos incarnate. Tanks collided in close combat, often just meters apart, firing shells that tore through armor and earth alike. The ground shook under the impact of explosions, while fire and smoke engulfed the horizon. Crews fought not just with their weapons, but with sheer determination to survive amid the relentless fury. Prokhorovka was a test of endurance, bravery, and tactical skill. Soviet commanders ordered their tanks to press forward despite heavy losses, knowing that slowing the German advance was vital to the larger defense of Kursk. The tank crews, many of them young and inexperienced, showed incredible courage, charging into the storm with the knowledge that failure meant disaster. Though the battle was brutal and the casualties high on both sides, Prokhorovka marked a crucial moment. The Soviet forces managed to halt the German armored assault, blunting their momentum and forcing them into a defensive stance. This storm of steel became a symbol of Soviet resilience and determination. Prokhorovka's legacy echoes through history as a defining clash where courage and sacrifice shaped the fate of the Eastern Front. Following the fierce clash at Prokhorovka, the Soviet High Command knew that simply holding the line was not enough. The momentum of the German assault had to be broken decisively, and that meant launching powerful, relentless counterattacks. The Red Army was ready to seize the initiative and push the invaders back. With precision and coordination, Soviet forces unleashed a series of devastating counteroffensives. Fresh tank units, infantry, and artillery were brought forward to strike at the exhausted and overextended German formations. The battlefield became a whirlwind of movement as Soviet troops exploited weaknesses in the enemy lines. These counterattacks were not mere defensive measures, they were bold, calculated strikes designed to encircle and destroy key elements of the German offensive. The Red Army utilized combined arms tactics, coordinating tanks, infantry, and air support to maximize their impact. The relentless Soviet pressure wore down the German forces. Supply lines were strained, fuel and ammunition dwindled, and morale faltered under the constant barrage. The technological edge of the German Tiger and Panther tanks was increasingly offset by sheer numbers, strategic positioning, and the dogged determination of Soviet crews. Each counterattack chipped away at the German momentum, gradually forcing the Wehrmacht onto the defensive. Soviet artillery barrages rained destruction, infantry stormed fortified positions, and tank crews engaged in fierce, close-quarter battles to regain lost ground. The Soviet response at Kursk demonstrated the evolution of the Red Army from a battered force into a well-coordinated, aggressive fighting machine. Their ability to transition from defense to offense marked a turning point in the battle and the war itself. By late July, the German offensive had ground to a halt. The initiative had passed decisively into Soviet hands, signaling that Kursk was no longer a battle to defend. It was a launchpad for the Soviet push westward toward Berlin and ultimate victory. By late July 1943, the mighty German offensive at Kursk had begun to crumble. What was meant to be a swift, crushing strike had turned into a grinding failure, with the Wehrmacht suffering devastating losses in men, tanks and morale. The battle that began with fierce German confidence was now shifting toward an irreversible collapse. The relentless Soviet counterattacks had exacted a heavy toll. German armored units, once feared as invincible, were battered and depleted. Fuel shortages and logistical breakdowns crippled the ability to reinforce and resupply the front lines. Commanders faced an impossible dilemma: press on with dwindling resources or retreat and risk total annihilation. Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs led to rigid commands that prevented tactical withdrawals. This stubbornness only worsened the situation, trapping German forces in deadly pockets and exposing them to devastating Soviet offensives. The Red Army seized the moment. With overwhelming numbers and fresh reserves, Soviet troops launched a series of coordinated attacks that shattered the remaining German lines. Entire divisions were encircled and destroyed, while others retreated in disarray under pressure. The collapse at Kursk was more than a tactical defeat. It was a strategic turning point. For the first time on the Eastern Front, German forces were decisively forced into retreat, marking the end of their ability to conduct large-scale offensives. In the East, this defeat signaled the irreversible decline of the Third Reich's power. The Soviet Union, emboldened and battle-hardened, began to push westward relentlessly, reclaiming lost territory and setting the stage for the final drive toward Berlin. Kursk was a bitter lesson for Hitler and his generals, a catastrophic failure, born from overconfidence and underestimating the Soviet resolve. The German collapse at Kursk changed the course of World War II, sealing the fate of Nazi Germany. The Battle of Kursk left an indelible mark on the fate of World War II and sealed the irreversible decline of Nazi Germany. Following the devastating defeat, the Wehrmacht was forced into a continuous retreat, losing its ability to launch major offensives on the Eastern Front. The once feared German war machine was now battered, its resources stretched to the breaking point. The loss of thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and experienced soldiers crippled their operational capacity. Supply lines were vulnerable, and morale among German troops plummeted as the Soviet forces advanced relentlessly. On the other hand, the Soviet Union emerged from Kursk invigorated and confident. The Red Army's successful defense and subsequent counter-offensives demonstrated a matured and formidable force capable of reclaiming lost territory and pressing the fight deep into enemy lands. The victory at Kursk marked the beginning of a strategic shift. From this point forward, the Soviets held the initiative, relentlessly pushing westward through Eastern Europe. Town after town fell, and the Nazi grip on occupied territories began to loosen. Politically and psychologically, the defeat at Kursk shattered the myth of German invincibility. The Third Reich's aura of unstoppable power was broken, emboldening Allied forces across all fronts. The aftermath also exposed the deep flaws within Hitler's command. His refusal to allow tactical retreats, obsession with offensive glory, and underestimation of Soviet capabilities had dire consequences. Kursk became a stark example of how overconfidence and flawed leadership could lead to catastrophic defeat. For the Soviet soldiers who fought through the brutal days and nights of Kursk, the battle was a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and ultimate triumph. It boosted morale and reinforced the determination to push all the way to Berlin. In the grand sweep of history, Kursk was more than a battle. It was the turning point that signaled the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, a decisive moment when the tides of war finally turned irreversibly against the Reich. The Battle of Kursk left a profound legacy that reshaped military strategy and the future of armored warfare. As the largest tank battle in history, it showcased the power of combined arms tactics, coordination, and preparation on an unprecedented scale. Kursk proved that sheer numbers and defensive depth could halt even the most technologically advanced forces. This battle influenced post-war military doctrines worldwide, emphasizing the importance of intelligence, fortified defenses, and the integration of infantry, artillery, and air support alongside tanks. It was a turning point that demonstrated the changing face of warfare, from rapid Blitzkrieg offensives to attritional, well-planned engagements. Moreover, Kursk symbolized the resilience and determination of the Soviet forces, who turned the tide against the German Wehrmacht and paved the way for the final Allied victory in Europe. If you found this journey through the Battle of Kursk fascinating, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What moment in history do you want us to explore next? Your support fuels our mission to bring history to life.